So Helen Nissenbaum is a philosopher and a professor of information science at Cornell Tech. Helen is a leading authority on privacy and the architect of a philosophical maxim on the positive contribution privacy provides us all. Her theory of contextual integrity, which defines privacy as the appropriate flow of information. Her research spanned issues of privacy, bias, trust, security, autonomy, and accountability in digital systems. The Atlantic had a few years ago a piece about contextual integrity, and they called Helen the brilliant philosopher who has put her approach onto privacy at the center of the national agenda, alluding to the immense impact of her work on federal policies and regulations. She received the 2014 Barwise Prize from the American Philosophical Association and the Covey Awards from the International Association of Computing and Philosophy. So Helen, thank you for moderating this, and all yours.
Thank you, Yoav, for that very generous introduction. Whoops, timer. At Cornell Tech, I run the Digital Life Initiative, which we label under the high-level heading of ethics, politics, and quality of life. And I'm going to offer that as the umbrella for what we're doing in this ethics and society panel. A few just very high-level remarks about this ethics, politics, and quality of life. I'm not sure, I'm assuming many people here are computer scientists, engineers, and not so many philosophers, but you're here because you're interested in the ethics and society issues. I should say this is an amazing conference. I had not really conceived of how energetic and large and active, since it's the first time, and I'm really honored that this group of us have been given the opportunity to speak to you. So ethics, good, bad, right, wrong, how people treat each other. Politics, having to do with the way societies govern themselves, governance. The distribution of power and authority, the distribution of resources in societies, seen through an ethical lens. And then finally, quality of life, which sometimes escapes the lens of ethics and politics, but it's about the good life. Aristotle might have called it the good life, whether we feel that our lives are meaningful. So issues of things like tech addiction are, of course, there are ethical dimensions to it, but it's about the quality of lives in this digital age. So that's the general umbrella. Now, three small points that I want to, actually, I don't think they're small, but anyway, 3 points I wanted to share about the panel. One is that this area that we're in is a research area. This isn't about, I'm a nice person and let me tell you what the right and wrong thing to do are in this particular situation. But folks on this panel have all, to a lesser and greater extent, devoted themselves to developing theory and following rigorous methods to arrive at systematic conclusions about some of the urgent issues that we're confronting today in the area of digital tech and AI. Then within that realm, there are two different types of approaches, and forgive the graphic design, which is not great, but one approach, which is more traditional, classical, is the idea of ethical implications. We take technology as given, and then we look at how these affect ethics, how they affect governance, how they affect quality of life. The other approach, which happens to be the one that dominates, I believe, in this panel, is the notion that technology itself is not neutral or value-free, that when computer scientists, let's say, or technologists generally design technical systems, when they decide on the architecture, on the features of the system, those decisions can be ethical decisions. And the people who work in this field, we often call it values embedded in technology in design. And what's so exciting about this approach, and I think most of my work fits in that, is that it really requires a close collaboration among the computer scientist and the humanist and social scientist. And this is what we're trying to reflect. These are some of the issues that arise in that space. And obviously, we're giving our panelists a Herculean task of saying, give us, in a nutshell, no more than 5 to 7 minutes, some flavor of the work that you're doing, and also know that these folks are doing a heck of a lot more, and perhaps this will pique your interest. So first, I'm going to call to the podium William Isaac, who is, whoops, there we go, a principal scientist at Google DeepMind.
Thank you, everyone, for coming and listening to the talk today, and thank you for all the organizers of the conference, and to Helen, in particular, for organizing this panel today. So in my 5-minute allotment, I'm going to try to kind of tell you the story about kind of an area of focus that has been, interestingly, was initially kind of a space that I didn't anticipate my career would be going into, but obviously now it's one that I think is a front of mind for everyone. This paper that I have listed up here was actually a summary of a taxonomy that we wrote in 2021. If you can cast your mind back to that period, this was kind of pre-ChatGPT. This was kind of kind of wide-scale deployment of kind of large-scale models. And one of the things that we were kind of thinking about at the time, at this moment, we were kind of, DeepMind was in the process of releasing its first ever language model, Gopher. The kind of development team came to us and said, hey, we have this really important technology. We think it's going to have a lot of ramifications on a lot of different parts of society, and we want to understand what the ramifications will be. Now, again, I stress, this was an era before we had any wild-scale deployment, so the kind of task of trying to say, okay, what does the kind of impact of a kind of emergent technology look like when you don't know what the form factor will be, you don't know how widely it will be deployed. And I thought this was a really great exercise because I think it demonstrates the capacity to conduct kind of technological foresight. And so what we did is we went through this process by which the modeling team behind at DeepMind and my team, I lead a team of researchers that focus on the kind of societal ramifications of our technologies that we make. We sat down and tried to work through together what did the space of harms that are likely to emerge if we see wide-scale deployment of language models. And as you can see from the list that we finally settled on, many of the areas that we've kind of, forecasted, 3-4 years ago, many of them we have seen today, whether that's thinking about the ramifications of representational harms or discrimination, misinformation, malicious use, and obviously environmental and economic impacts. And so, this was a really important and a watershed moment, both for how we think about these technologies and for how we design these technologies, because we thought if we had a really good understanding of how we could conduct foresight, that we could try to anticipate as capabilities increase in our systems. One issue with that is that we said, okay, wow, we really do have a good handle on the risk. How do we actually get a handle on what we do about it? So I think a lot of us kind of naturally gravitated to this idea of evaluation. And I think this will be the kind of focus of my discussion for the rest of my, 3 minutes. Particularly, one of the things that we noticed, obviously DeepMind released their Gopher models, and then Sparrow, and then now with Gemini, we moved into an era where we had multimodal systems, systems that have both inputs and outputs that are beyond just text. But one of the things that we realized was that as we were in the process of developing Gemini was that for a lot of the modalities that we would anticipate would be in prevalent use, we didn't have full coverage of how to actually evaluate systems. And so the paper, as you can see on the top left corner, if you want to see the link of the paper, we actually went through and kind of canvassed canvassed the entire literature that we could find on what evaluations track back to what harms that we had anticipated and forecasted would be problematic for wide-scale deployment of generative models. And as you notice, we were disproportionately focused on text as a field and not really adequately prepared for other modalities in respect to safety. And this was a very eye-opening moment for us because we realized that as capabilities of our systems increase, we had to really make investments in the type of evaluations that we do. And I think on the right-hand side, you can see this kind of, square that has these kind of configurations. These map onto the different forms of evaluation. So one of the things that we noticed in our research is that most of the evaluations that you see in regards to safety are really focused on the base model itself. But what we know, and obviously we've seen through use, is that these systems now impact both not just the base model, but people building applications on top of it. And also the wide-scale kind of deployment of these systems to a large numbers of users. Now, I think what we can see is that disproportionately our evaluations do target this area, but so they don't really give us guarantees about what are the impact of more capable systems we have on our interactions with them, as well as what they will have on society as a whole. So finally, where we're at now is we kind of went through thinking, okay, we need to do evaluations to we need to think about better governance. And so one of the things that we tried to do in just being open and transparent about our process is we wrote a paper outlining how we think about our ecosystem evaluations. And in particular, there's a lot of discussion both publicly and amongst labs on red teaming and how it connects to the other things that we do. And what we tried to do was marry the kind of role of kind of adversarial testing with two forms of evaluation. So one, evaluations that are designed to improve the safety of the model through development, but then also having forms of accountability, both in terms of kind of pre-release as well as kind of external accountability. And so I feel like this approach, I think this is a system that we have in deployment now, I think tries to move us towards a system of better accountability. And I think I may be at my 1 minute allotment or rapidly closing it. So I'll leave you with kind of two sets of open questions, actually three. So the first one is validity. So with all the things I've said, it kind of gives the impression that we kind of have really good, conceptually valid forms of evaluation that track back to the harms that I showed in the first slide. We don't. Right? This field is very nascent, and I think there's still quite a bit of work to actually make sure that we have evaluations that track back to the real harms that people will experience. I think the second one is about capability. Our systems today are significantly increasing their capability. As I mentioned, in the past 3 years, we've gone from text-to-text models to fully multimodal models with both inputs and outputs that are across image, text, and video. And I think we're probably going to see increases in that capability over the coming years. If our ability to measure and assess safety is not tracking with that, that's a problem. And I think the third one is alignment. All the things I showed you are obviously DeepMind's take on what we think the scope of harm is. But obviously, society and other stakeholders should be involved as well. So we should be thinking about what are different ways that we align how we measure and what we deem as safe beyond just what I think a kind of small number of stakeholders actually consider. So I think that's it, and I look forward all to your questions in the Q&A.
Good to enter with the splash.
I just want to say that one of the reasons we're going at a good pace is that we hope to have lots of Q&A and discussion following the panelist remarks.
Thanks so much, Helen. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Emily Black. I am an assistant professor of computer science, engineering, and data science at NYU. Today, I'm going to be talking kind of about some of the more specific challenges with AI and Gen AI evaluation, in particular around discrimination, and how that interacts with emerging AI policy. So several pieces of regulatory guidance have come out recently that have been calling for AI and Gen AI evaluation around discrimination. For example, something from the Blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights has suggested that steps should be taken to evaluate multiple models and select the one that has the least adverse impact. But this is kind of high-level legislation that is telling other federal agencies to come up with their own rules about how they're going to regulate these systems, and this is still ongoing. So basically, how is this going to shake out? How should this actually be designed and implemented? Let's say, as an example, that we follow a framework that's kind of similar as to what's laid out here in this AI Bill of Rights. Let's try a bunch of models, test them, and then pick the best one. And say a bank follows this framework. Say it gets these results here. It's testing demographic disparity on some data set. This is HumDub. You don't have to worry about that. And it says, OK, I did a bunch of tests across my models, and I found logistic regression was the best one. I'll connect this to GenAI in a second. Don't worry about it. So some regulatory agency might say, that looks great. But what they may not know, and what the bank might actually not even know, what they might be doing unintentionally, is not doing a sufficiently robust evaluation of that disparity. And so if you repeated the same test that they did over multiple runs, train, test, split, random seeds, what have you, they might have actually found, as we found in this case, that logistic regression was the worst possible model that they could have chosen. So they could have done this intentionally or unintentionally, but we call this kind of risk of being able to follow the letter of the law, or the letter of some guideline, practice, regulation, while still deploying a discriminatory model, discrimination hacking or dehacking. And I think this is where, so this paper came out in FACT 2024 and is kind of about AI systems generally, but this really amplifies when we think about generative AI in particular, and this has to do with what William was talking about of capacity in particular, so I'm thinking still about technical evaluations of the model itself. But even there are some challenges that generative AI systems really magnify that can allow you to come up with a safety, I'm thinking about in particular discrimination evaluation, that looks good on its face, but actually doesn't prevent the deployment of a harmful system. So one example, this first one here, is that because we're now having outputs that don't really map to a downstream decision that might, that's where we usually think about discrimination, at least traditionally in the law. We have something called the disparate impact doctrine, which says things like you can't hire way more men than women or women than men if that's not what your overall demographics look like, unless that's necessary for your business, right? And so the way that they would usually test this is by seeing, the distribution of who a company hires. But in order to see whether or not a Gen AI model is adding to that discrimination, it's unclear how to map the Gen AI system's output, which might just be a resume summary, say, onto that 0-1 decision of who ends up getting hired in the long run. Second is that if we think about the complex interaction modes that Gen AI systems have, you often have long conversations or kind of like a back and forth with the Gen AI systems. A lot of evaluations, not only just discrimination evaluations, but AI safety in general, are done on just one turn of that process. You just ask one question to the Gen AI system, and then you see what the output is, when actually the amount of discrimination that can come out of a system may change over time in like a multi-turn conversation scenario. So what we've shown in some upcoming work is that guarantees that you might be able to give on a one-turn interaction won't generalize to a multi-turn interaction. Third is that a lot of the methods that are currently out there for showing a lack of discrimination are actually quite variable in their results. So we've shown that red teaming results can actually change quite a lot depending on what baseline model you use. And so if it's a very similar situation to the original dehacking example, where you could ostensibly do a number of red teaming tests and then pick one that makes your model look good and have an agency not know that you're doing that behind the scenes, or you may have just been unlucky and picked a red teaming result that was different from the norm. And finally, because it's so much more common now to have Gen AI systems open to user modification, for example, changing hyperparameters or fine-tuning, it's both unclear who should be doing the fairness evaluation, the person who deploys the baseline model or the person who ends up using it and adjusting it. And no matter who is doing it, it's difficult to evaluate a system in its entirety if you are the user, since you may not have the resources in order to test that system, but also it's very difficult if you're the deployer, since you don't know where that system might end up being used or how it might be changed along the way. So this is all to think about how can we generate robust evaluation techniques for Gen AI models, not just ones that have high coverage or that get good metrics on one test, but that you can actually be certain are going to give similar results across various evaluation setups of their deployment setting. So I will turn it off to the next person for now, but I think was I too fast?
You have 1 minute.
I have 1 minute? Okay.
But that's okay, I'll give it back to you.
Okay, at the end? Lovely. I might have talked too fast, but if anyone has any questions, do feel free to follow up.
Well, I think I'm terrified.
She did say that she'll splash some water at us if we go over our time. So, hi everyone, my name is David Widder. I'm a postdoc in the DLI at Cornell Tech. I did my PhD in the School of Computer Science at Carnegie Mellon. I ended up doing something closer to anthropology. What I was doing was I was interviewing people who create new technology, people like us, about how they understand the downstream impact of what they create, how they understand their sense of responsibility for what they create enables. And through about 110 different interviews, I found that a really common refrain was, well, what I'm building is general purpose. It can be used to do a lot of different things. So it's really hard for me to feel accountable for how it is used in particular. And we see this, this makes some amount of sense. We see this a lot. We also see this in different company representations. Anthropic saying that they have models that are right-sized for any task, and then only very deep in the 42-page PDF do they say, oh, but don't do this and don't do that. So sort of this notion of general purposeness is what I want to interrogate today. First, for anyone who has read Values in Design, or anyone who's read or heard of Langdon Winner's Apocryphal Bridges, or thought about affordances, Don Norman, that really doesn't hold up. You can design things in ways that make certain downstream outcomes more likely or other downstream outcomes less likely. So there's a broad range of tools available in STS and philosophy of technology for us to think harder about this form of disavowal that goes, I'm building a general purpose tool, or what we're building is general purpose, so we're not accountable for particular harms. That really doesn't hold up on further scrutiny. Unfortunately, my results also showed that in the incentives that govern tech companies, STS doesn't carry a lot of weight. Unfortunately, neither does philosophy of technology, but lawyers and threats of lawsuits do. So what we're doing is we're looking for tools available within largely copyright law and tort law to think, what are the tools available at our disposal to ask, does this so-called general purpose tool carry liability, carry accountability for how it's used downstream? And I think that we're going to end up in a place that is much more applies a lot greater scrutiny towards creators of so-called general purpose tools. As an example, one test that holds up in certain parts of law is the notion of profit. If a provider benefits from providing a so-called general purpose tool and benefits from that perhaps even more than other uses when it's harmful, that is one test or one factor that courts, I'm told from my lawyer friends, I'm not, will use in thinking about this. So when we map this onto the AI supply chain, when we think about foundation models, or when we think about things that can be used for many different purposes, the takeaway here is that we ought to think a little bit more about how we are contributing, profiting, controlling, having knowledge of, distinguishing between, and also whether or not the harmful uses themselves outweigh the positive ones, and because we're going to put legal teeth here. The other thing I want to talk about with respect to general purpose technology is actually work that was published at EMNLP last year. And I want to talk about corporate power. When companies are the ones providing these so-called general purpose tools or these foundation models, what does that do to a research ecosystem? And is it doing things that we like? And so I want to talk about how so-called general purpose tools shape research to corporate ends. What we did in this EMNLP study, I'm going to back up just so we don't distract each other with what's on the slide yet, but we interviewed a bunch of folks who have been in the NLP community for a very long time, largely professors who have seen the field change from, early stages, a lot of different people doing a lot of different techniques, to a whole auditorium with a balcony seating filled to the brim, talking about, well, not right now, this is the ethics panel, talking about specifically language models and how we have gone from, an NLP community or even computational linguistics community to something that's so focused around language models. And what we saw is, as this community grew, these participants talked about how it became harder to know about all the different work going on. So it became harder to have this sort of qualitative sense of what the good work was. So this leads to benchmark bonanza, as I call it, or as we called it. The idea that you can't keep in touch with everyone doing all the cool work. So the way that we're going to find the good work is centralize around benchmarks to give us a common basis to compare across different research communities. Now, what this can lead to is the idea, who's heard of hardware lotteries? Yeah, right? So there's also software lotteries, right? We do the research that software makes easy, If you have really useful frameworks for doing one thing, that makes it very easy to do that thing, and it sort of shapes the direction of research. Now, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your vantage point, the people that, or the corporations are the ones that have the power to build these frameworks, maintain these frameworks, and then also have the compute necessary to perform well or to make full use of these frameworks. And so we have this situation where going from a plethora of different techniques to a centralization around particular software, particular frameworks that are, because they're built by companies, they are serving the interests of those companies. Now, I'm happy for TensorFlow to exist, I'm happy for PyTorch to exist, but I also want to ask what would have existed in their absence. And as a result, we're now sort of centralizing around techniques that work very well with large amounts of compute. And we have this situation where before, people in our interview study did not feel like they had to compete with Google. I mean, there was an understanding that they had a bajillion GPUs, or they had just a bunch of resources they could throw at the problem. And we found ourselves in this situation where, no, now you're competing against someone who can process the whole internet, or now you're competing on those terms. So as one participant reflected, we're building an upper class of AI where to get that extra 2% and get the boldface black entry on the table, you have to build on top of the large models. And this is sort of a pernicious way that corporate produced foundation models and even just frameworks have shaped the field towards where we end up. And I think a little bit more of reflexivity, introspection about whether we're happy with where we are and whether there's other things we want to do that aren't well served right now might be good. The paper is available there, and some of the authors are actually in the audience. So thanks for being here.
Hello. Thank you for having us. I learned a little bit in the course of the day about the kind of theory of the case that this conference represents, and I consider myself kind of a fellow traveler in what I understand to be kind of breaking out and having broader conversations. I think it speaks really well for your community that one of the plenary sessions on the first day is a bunch of people talking about ethics, and I hope we're going to make it worth your while. My name is Paul Ohm. I teach at Georgetown Law. I'm a law professor, and I have focused in my career on privacy and surveillance. Helen, do you need me to do something?
Yes.
Oh, you want me to advance the slide?
Just so that they know.
Yeah, okay. I have focused on privacy and surveillance. I am focusing increasingly on artificial intelligence, and a lot of this stems from the beginning of my career as a computer science undergrad, who then became a Department of Justice computer crime prosecutor. And I've also worked for the Federal Trade Commission and for the Attorney General of Colorado. If you'll indulge me for a moment, I have a good friend who builds large language models named Jonathan Frankel, who said that he thinks of the law, we've exposed him to some of what we do on our side of the fence, as applied ethics, where we've boiled down certain kind of abstract ethical principles and put them into law. So if you'll indulge me while I tell you a little sociological history of people who focus on computer science and law. In 1996, we created a new field called cyber law. This was after a guy named John Perry Barlow wrote something called the Declaration of Independence of Cyber Law. And the cyber law era kind of flourished for about 10 years. It was fizzy and lively, and it's where I got started as a law professor. And then we spent 20 years not talking to one another. We broke into these interdisciplinary little camps, and so we focused on intellectual property, or we focused on privacy. There were smaller groups full of people who focused on telecommunications law and antitrust and robotics, and we stayed separate from one another, although we were all born around the same time with the dawn of the commercial internet, notwithstanding technological development after technological development. So we survived smartphones and social media and blockchain and crypto, and all the while we said, that's not interesting enough for us to talk to our awkward cousins on the other side of town. We're happy where we are in our own communities. That's all changed with the last 18 months and with the November 2022 launch of ChatGPT and what it's taught us about the changes that are coming from large language models. And the thesis of what I'm trying to tell you in my 7 minutes is stop talking about copyright. So my impression has been that if you take a median computer scientist, either a professor or a grad student or a postdoc, and you say, what do you know about law and policy as it implicates your work, you're probably going to get some very informed opinions about copyright. I think a large part of that is because this is the only law I'm going to show you in my entire talk. This is Section 504 of the Copyright Act in the United States. And here's where it says that OpenAI may be liable for $150,000 per work, per copyrighted work that they've trained on. And so it's no surprise to me that there is a lot of concern and focus and attention on copyright law. When you have the New York Times bring a complaint that credibly recites that there might be billions of dollars of damages at stake, of course, this is going to drive business decisions and priorities, and that's going to trickle down and start to drive research questions. And to be clear, there are fundamentally interesting and important questions at the heart of copyright law, right? My copyright law friends, and I'm not a copyright law scholar, are going to be thinking about what this means for fair use and what this means for this thing we call substantial similarity. But what I find pernicious and worrying is that this is happening in a way that is kind of crowding out all of the other values, laws, subdisciplines that we have that I think raise some very different issues. And so I know you're going to have trouble reading this, but this is my ham-fisted attempt to kind of compare what happens when you view the world through this first column of this table, intellectual property. The interdisciplinary and disciplinary baggage that you're bringing along without maybe realizing it if you're new to the field. So copyright, again, is in this first column of intellectual property, and it's a kind of set of laws, rules, and conversations that are really focused on property law and to a much, much, much lesser extent, labor law. It's a field that's dominated by economics and economists. The main interdisciplinary model and move of this field is economics. Let's pick another field before we get to my field, national security. I could play the same game, right? And maybe there are people in this room who are focused on the national security implications of large language models and what they say about misinformation or what they say about competitiveness with China. And so with that frame, you're now focused on security and secrecy as your overwhelming frames. You are embracing a very technocratic mindset. All we need to do is put the right encryption in the right place, and we'll be better off. You're tapping into fields like international relations. I come from the right column, the third column. This is the field of privacy, and privacy in some ways has been, I think, deeply misunderstood by many in the large language model community. Privacy is a field that focuses on humanity and human beings and autonomy and dignity and choice. Our closest neighbors are the STS scholars that David was talking about. We think a lot about philosophers and sociologists. We tolerate economists. They are part of our community as well, but we never let them forget that they're second-class citizens. And so the point here is this should at least be a big tent, that as computer scientists begin to learn about law and ethics as it applies to large language models and other forms of foundation models and generative AI, and choose whatever label makes you comfortable, that it's not just to the copyright scholars and the copyright issues that you are turning. And of course, if I were a more polite scholar, I would sit down right now and say, that's all we need, a big tent, don't forget the rest of us. I actually am not a very polite scholar, and I think we need a counterweight to copyright, because copyright is so inflected with this kind of narrow view that really has me worried. And I think of all the fields out there, privacy is the only one that's well positioned to be this counterweight. And that's because when we say privacy, we're not restricting ourselves to models that have memorization problems, or to models that can, be used to elicit some of their training data, or to reversibility of models. When I talk to computer scientists who work in language modeling, that's often what they think I mean by privacy. In privacy scholarship, we've actually become the home for the work that Emily was talking about and that William was talking about when you focus on fairness and you focus on discrimination and you focus on misinformation and deep fakes. These have all come under this kind of clumsy label of privacy. We probably just need a different word because it's confusing. And so here's my attempt to kind of sum this all up. Privacy is any information harm or problem that is not intellectual property. And that's meant to be as sweeping and as imperial as it sounds. And again, the point isn't that we should only have a bipolar world of values and law and ethics. The point is we have counterweights to what I think is an overweight on copyright. I went to ICML both of the last 2 years, and when you go to the places where grad students are talking about the law, 80% of them seem to be talking about copyright. I don't think it's enough to say we should talk about copyright and we should find the second pole, and I think that pole might be privacy, to serve as this counterweight. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Looking forward to your conversation.
Thank you to the panelists. I feel I should leave this slide on. I'm in complete agreement with you, Paul. All right, so we'd love to take questions from the audience. I believe there are microphones. So maybe it's the standard practice just to line up by the mics, and my usual thing is, keep it brief. I might take a few questions at a time before I turn back to the panel for responses. And if you don't mind, could you introduce yourself? Thanks.
Thank you so much. I'm Divya. I work at Google. This was an excellent panel, very thought-provoking. Thank you to all the panelists. William, what you said about what we don't know the harms of these technologies could be in some form of taxonomy. I'd love to cherry pick on malicious use in this case. And Emily, what you said about multi-turn harms was super useful. What got me thinking through that was that AI systems perform these harms in the broader ecology in which they're deployed. And increasingly, the community is now looking at agentic uses. So I'm curious, what our frameworks are, ways to even think about harms of AI systems when coupled with other agents or tools and by malicious actors. Is there any way that you've thought about evaluating these systems for broader harms and tools? Thank you.
Thank you, and maybe I'll take that question as well. Thanks.
I'm Anna from Tohoku University. So as a hypothetical, I guess, one thing I could foresee happening is someone trying to form some sort of regulatory body, something like the FDA, but for AI, right? So except for the obvious of being run by non-experts, I would like to hear your opinions on what potential harms we could foresee from such a body.
Maybe I'll take one more. Is that all right? Can you keep it in your heads, panelists? Okay, one more.
Yeah, and I think this is maybe somewhat related. I'm Amanda from Carnegie Mellon. And I think a through line of the comments was maybe that what is legal to train on is not always moral to train on, and that both copyright law and discrimination law are maybe insufficient. And so I'm wondering, is this a problem with updating or correcting the law? Are there considerations here that you think are fundamentally incompatible with the expression in a legal framework? And if so, what fills that gap?
All right, so maybe we'll just run down and pick whichever questions you would like to answer.
I think my microphone's working.
Could you Oh, you just have to turn the
now
switch on.
now it's working. Yeah, so I guess maybe quickly on the agents question. So I would definitely say the frameworks that we kind of proposed in our initial socio-technical evals paper, I do think roughly kind of gives the kind of scaffolding to questions around agency. So I definitely do think you'll see some things that you can test at a level of a model, but there's going to be other layers, whether they're interacting with other systems or interacting in large-scale systems like in society, that you're going to necessarily need to find new evaluations for. I guess this is the plug where we wrote a whole paper on the ethics of advanced AI assistance that was recently published, where we talk a lot more about the uniqueness of a kind of harms of agentic systems, because there are definitely some differences when you have systems that do perform tasks outside of the kind of chain of what the kind of like actor is providing as a prompt. And I do think that that particular class of harms, I do think, warrants more scrutiny.
Emily?
If I know how to turn on my mic. Can you help me out here?
So you just flip that switch right there. There you go.
All right. These are all great questions. Thank you so much. Quickly on the agentic thing, I guess I'll just say basically what William said. But I would say I think it's really important, and thankfully I think the emerging regulation has highlighted the need to actually test systems in deployment environments. And so I think that actually that's an area where the regulation knows what it wants, but the research hasn't met the challenge yet. And so I think that's actually a really important area for ongoing research, is to be able to make evaluation systems that can either target very common deployment or agentic systems or deployment environments, or be able to be flexible across them but still test relevant harms. I think something that we've seen in our work is that using a suite of metrics across that are more context specific for what your downstream task actually will be. So if you're doing resume summary that will eventually be interacting with another system, think about what the discrimination could be of that downstream system and try to find metrics that can speak to that from your baseline model. But I'm happy to talk about that offline with my upcoming paper. And I think I would say for the last question about are there, if I understood it correctly, are the legal frameworks incompatible with the Gen AI harms that exist now? I'm curious to hear what my colleagues have to say about that, but I definitely think that there isn't a natural fit. Like for discrimination law, at least, it really is just all about allocative harms. So, what is the distribution of people who got this job? What is the distribution of people who got access to credit? And I think the mapping task from a Gen AI system to that allocative harm is tentative at best in order to actually establish a clear way to kind of go after the bias that's happening in that system. I don't think that that's an unsolvable problem, but I do think that it's certainly a challenge. But I'll leave the rest to my colleagues.
David?
Yeah, I want to weigh in briefly on the second question on FDA for AI. Mainly just to plug a really good report on this from the AI Now Institute. I have not read the whole report, but I've seen it presented enough times. And basically, I think the analogy of the FDA is thrown around a lot. And then when I see this work presented, I'm like, wow, there's actually a lot. The FDA is a very large, has a lot of tools that can help us think about how to regulate AI. I think perhaps the point that gives me the most pause is that, to approve a drug, it has to be safe and effective. We might have maybe some idea about what safety means for AI, and even that is tenuous. I don't know if we know what effective means, and effective for whom and for what, and whose values are we centering here. For a patient, I think it's clear we want the drug to cure the thing for the person that's in front of us, and maybe there's some population level questions as well, but I'd encourage, if we want to think harder about what a regulatory body might be, there's that really good report that does it. I think also we think about the FDA a lot about approving or not approving a drug. It actually does a lot more than that, and it actually facilitates the production of information and transparency that is really useful for other regulatory and scientific purposes that might help it be a fairly fruitful, at least thinking tool for how we might regulate AI. Lawyer.
No, briefly, because I want to see all these other questions. In both the third and fourth questions, which were both about regulation, I kind of want to exhort you all to stop seeing laws as force that's developed by other people, right? You all are citizens of some country on this planet. You all should be part of this conversation. Law is not going to solve all of our problems. Law is not going to solve most of our problems. But hopefully you see yourselves as empowered partners in deciding when law can help solve problems that technology alone can't, or that social norms alone can't, or markets alone can't. And so, yeah, the law is not going to fit really well with emerging harms from new technology. That's ever been the case with every new technology. And so hopefully we as a group of people come together and make it better, right? That's the whole point of law.
I mean, adding to what Paul just said, the law needs some instruction on what harm is, what counts as a harm in the first place. And dare I say, this is where the philosophers come into the picture, at least in trying to systematize that discussion. All right, so now, we'll do the same bouncing back and forth until everyone's had a turn, and then we'll go back to the panel.
Andreas Stolke, Unifor. So the law, and also for ethics purposes, we put things and entities into categories. For example, citizens have different rights from residents versus non-residents. When I want to decide what I can do to some entity, I need to know whether it's a human or an animal or a plant, even maybe, and your rules may differ depending on your persuasions. So, fun question to you. Does artificial intelligence have rights? Sort of a sci-fi question. Does it matter? What should the law be saying about how, whether I should be able to know whether I'm interacting with an artificial intelligence or a human intelligence, for example? Should there be some kind of rule against, deep faking intelligence, essentially? So those kind of questions, I don't know where they fit into your taxonomy. I guess according to Paul, they're all part of privacy.
Yeah, definitely. Okay.
Hi, I'm Nilufar. I'm from UW. Hi, Paul. And what I wanted to ask is kind of sparked by what Paul and Emily said, especially Emily's point on we want benchmarks that are more robust than just coverage, so that you can move them to different things. And I think one problem we have is that in general with regulations and law, with purpose, they're ambiguous, right? There's ambiguity so that you can decide based on cases. But on the other hand, from the technical side, we're used to having benchmarks that have ground truth. That's why people are doing so much work on math and code, because you can test it. It's correct or it's not. But then when it comes to things like privacy or fairness, it's harder, especially in text, to draw that line. And I think that is one problem that we have, is that there is so much ambiguity. We have a privacy benchmark and there is no ground truth for it. And people are like, okay, and I was like, the ground truth is people. What would people do? So I wonder what you guys think should be the guidelines of if people are studying these things that don't have ground truth, how should we approach it? How should we approach the ambiguity? And then how can we have robust benchmarks for such cases?
All right, and then we'll take what seems to be the last question. Thanks, Nilufar.
Hi there. Thanks so much for your remarks. I'm Brian. I'm a researcher at Bloomberg. And my question, so David, in your remarks, you sort of touched on this theme around affordances and about how sort of ChatGPT is notably affordance-free. It's just a blank text box that you put your hopes and dreams into. And I was just sort of curious from the panel whether if you could envision two different worlds, the one where you have lots of general purpose tools that have sort of very few affordances and are very inherently fallible, or you could have sort of many restricted tools that aim at very specific use cases but are opinionated and show you how to use them. Which of those two worlds would you rather see?
All right, thank you. William?
Okay. I guess, let's see, is my microphone back on? Okay, let's see. Okay. Let's see, I'll go down the list. So do AIs need to have rights? So generally speaking, when I talk about like things like agentic systems or AGI, I put the preface in that these are still technologies that have not emerged yet. I'm not of the belief of kind of engaging in debates around what those look like until we see the capabilities that merit it. I'm very empirical in that way. So I guess when AI systems have theory of mind and have consciousness, then I think we can then have a more substantive conversation, but we're not at that point yet. So no, I don't think it's necessarily something that we need to endeavor in at this stage. I think someone had a question about the kind of ambiguity of kind of like ground truth. Yeah, so I mean, I think there's kind of like a research reality, and I think there's like a kind of commercial reality. Despite the fact that I think there is some trouble trying to find ground truth in evaluations for things like fairness or hate speech, whatever it is. Obviously, in a commercial setting, you have to make some decisions. And obviously, I think everyone at this point is well aware that like most of these companies go through this kind of iterative cycle of trying to set one threshold and one specific definition of these terms. The people engage with the system, they complain, they say they don't like this, or they think this boundary is too tight, or this group should be included, and so these things get refined. So iteratively, we do begin to get some kind of, equilibrium or status quo of what kind of these different terms mean. But I do think, obviously, once again, this is still being led by industry. This is not necessarily incorporating other stakeholders, and the mechanism by which that emerge is kind of very opaque. So my kind of, my challenge, I think maybe Paul has hit on this, is that obviously you all are empowered as kind of both people and citizens to actually have a say in this, and I think part of having a kind of dialogue both as research and as a kind of community of people is actually to set what those social norms are. And I think,
you. Oh, sorry.
Sorry. I'll move on after this.
All right. Okay, Emily.
Yeah, thank you all so much, and to not repeat William at all, so that was already covered. I will just add on to that second question. I think that's an excellent question. I think I'm taken with it. I think the one thing that I would say is that robustness, I think, is a slightly separate challenge from figuring out what the ground truth is. I think, I totally hear you, but I think either once we figure out what it is, and I think it is kind of a community-led effort where we're all trying to help answer it together, or while we're on the path to finding out what it is, while we have these kind of half answers that we're figuring out right now, like red teaming, for example, as a way to evaluate systems, let's at least try to make sure that every single time you run the same test, you don't get a different result on these systems. And I think that could be a problem even if we had ground truth, and so I think that's a separate thing to focus on. So I think that they're both really important things to think about, but yeah, totally loved your question. And then I actually mostly wrote notes on your question, so I'm going to turn it down the line.
All right, David.
Oh, thanks. Just a few brief things. I agree with William. I don't think we're near the point where it makes sense to discuss whether AI should have rights. I don't think we'll get there, but we're certainly not near there in any case. Our attention is best spent asking why humans don't have rights today, and that is the much more higher order question for me. Now, the question about ground truth is actually really interesting because I think there are very narrow cases where cat dog or hot dog not hot dog, where you can actually produce ground truth that is very truthy, very real, but after that I think it breaks down fairly quickly. And having collaborated with a bunch of anthropologists and a bunch of social scientists where where there's this firm notion of ground truth, they've handled this problem, and the question and the answer is let's try and think about how different people might define the problem, or might define what counts as truth in a problem, and adopting a much more interpretivist, constructivist notion around truth, or situated, as I'd call it, situating it in a particular case, where what would be helpful in this particular context. Those tools, those kind of questions around situated knowledge, can be really useful for thinking about ground truth questions and building technical systems, because it sort of explodes the problem in a very productive way. To the point about affordance-free, I just want to be very clear. I actually don't think there's such thing as affordance-free, so I'm sorry if that was unclear. The questioner brought up the example of GPT with just a text box. Well, they've made it sometimes where you have to log in. They've made it sometimes where you don't have to log in. If I ask it to help me build a bomb, it will probably say no, but if I say I'm writing a fiction novel where the main character builds a bomb, it might tell me how. Like these are all affordances. These are like having to log in, having a text box at all, like having all of these different things. These are affordances, and they materially affect the likelihood of misuse or the likelihood of even just inspiring certain uses over others. So there are affordances. There is no such thing, in my view, as an affordance-free technology. And for that reason, I think we ought to ask what affordances are we building, even if we're not trying to, and what might those enable or not, or actually make more likely or not. Yeah.
Great. Okay, Paul?
Two things Helen said at lunch. One, we don't have to all answer each question, but your questions are too good. We can't help ourselves. Two, we should play the role of audience member, and so I'm so glad Nilüfer asked her question, because this notion of evaluation looms large over this whole conversation. And David and Emily gave great answers about how we can find things we can measure that kind of take the place of our lack of knowledge as domain specialists about models. But then my answer is it doesn't always have to come within the model or within the technical system. And so you can pause your model at times and say, we're going to ask a human judge to exhibit wisdom and make a difficult call. One of my favorite papers in my space is Little Red, that argues that the reason you want a human being sentencing you to prison is not because of accuracy or ground truth or evaluation. It's because there is a solemn moment where that human being pictures themselves in your shoes before putting you away in a prison cell. And if that sounds hackneyed or something that you don't like because you can't measure it, I would just ask you to speak to people who have been on both sides of that sentencing to figure out why. Sometimes the answer will be, we can't do this within our system. We're going to have to pause. We're going to have to add friction. We're going to have to slow things down and appeal to some other process, procedure, or person to give the answer that our evaluations can't provide. So,
thank you. That was a great answer to a great question, and to all of you in the audience and all of you in the panel, thank you so much.